if you look at the Earth from above, satellite imagery, you find this interesting area in the middle of the screen, all the way from Western Sahara to Gobi Desert, all the way from Morocco to China and Mongolia. There's this area, let's call it the great area of wear and tear. If you look around, pretty much is sort of everything is pretty much green overall, but there's this massive area of wear and tear in the middle of this image, going from the Western Sahara Desert to the Gobi Desert, from Morocco to China. Now, what's interesting, right in the middle of this great area of wear and tear, what do we find? Somewhere here, well, it would be Iraq, okay? Right in the middle of this great area of wear and tear. So let's just zoom in a little bit. And it's interesting that it's right at the beginning of the Bible that the story of the Bible actually begins right there, at that very spot. The place we call Iraq now used to be called Babylon, and before Babylon used to be called something else. And the reason why is because of the river that flows through Babylon, this river right here, and that's the river Euphrates. It's very interesting because it's mentioned right at the very beginning of the story of the Bible, river Euphrates, in the story of the Garden of Eden. But it's also mentioned in the very last book of the Bible, in Revelation, river Euphrates, and it's right there at the end of the story too. So, what do we find when we read the book of Genesis? If you look at chapter 2, we read about 4 different rivers flowing through the Garden of Eden. So that's Genesis chapter 2. And this is what it says. Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 to 14. Now a river went out of Eden to water the garden. And from there it parted and it became 4 riverheads. The name of the first is Pishon. It is the one which skirts the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and the onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one which goes around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Hiddekel, or Tigris. It is the one which goes towards the east of Assyria. The fourth river is the Euphrates. So we got Tigris, Euphrates, and 2 other rivers mentioned here, Pishon and Gihon. So it's interesting that this river here, that's River Euphrates, zoom in a little bit, coming out of here, what we see in modern Iraq from Baghdad. Let's zoom in a little bit. And what does it say? Does it say anything? It should say Euphrates. Yeah, there it is, Euphrates. So that's the river Euphrates. One of the 4 rivers that are mentioned at the very beginning of the story of the Bible, coming out of here somewhere. I don't know which direction it flows, northbound or southbound, I'm not sure. But it's right there, right here in modern Iraq, which is right at the center of this great area of wear and tear, which goes from Western Sahara to Gobi Desert. It's right here. And it's very interesting because, well, a lot of people consider the account of the Garden of Eden mythical, not really real, not historical. And it's interesting. There's something central about it in the Bible. But also, if you look at the earth as it is now, from our modern point of view, from above, from satellite, there is something on the earth, the great area of wear and tear. Something's been going on there. And the Bible claims actually that this is the heart, the, the, the center of the origins of all civilizations. So we come back into this, let's say this circle here, the Middle East, centered in Iraq or Babylon, if you use the biblical terms. And we have 4 rivers mentioned that are coming out of the great river of the Garden of Eden. So one of the rivers is Euphrates, which is this river here. And the other river flowing towards ancient Babylon is this river here, or the river Tigris. Let's have a look if you can see that. Is anything? There you go, Tigris. Tigris. So we got these 2 rivers here. Now, whether they originally looked like that thousands of years ago or not, probably not exactly the same, because the rivers, the bodies of water, they change over time. But overall, that's the area, rough area, central area of the beginning of the story of the Bible here, centered around the modern Iraq, or as the Bible story continues, it mentions soon after that Babylon or Babel. And the other 2 rivers, nobody really knows what the other 2 rivers are. But Euphrates and Tigris, these are the rivers, everybody agrees these are the 2 rivers that are mentioned. If you take it seriously, these are the 2 rivers mentioned in the beginning of the creation account, at the beginning of the Bible, the rivers that are linked with the Garden of Eden. Now, there are 2 other rivers mentioned in this area. But pretty much nothing here. It all looks empty and waterless overall on this side, that side. But just a bit further to the south, there is a great river here, the River Nile. And some people think this may be one of the 4 rivers that was mentioned at the beginning, flowing from the Garden of Eden, the River Nile. It would make sense because this is one of the earliest civilizations, biblically speaking, the Egyptian kingdom, the Egyptian civilization. That is the place where the story of Moses begins. And that's one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient times. So that's also linked with the very beginning of the Bible. Egypt is mentioned in the book of Genesis. Abraham was going up and down from Egypt to Canaan, and his son Isaac was doing the same, going up and down, moving back and forth. So it's there from the very beginning of the story, actually. Egypt in the book of Genesis, and Babylon or Babel or Chaldea, they're mentioned already in the book of Genesis, in the first book of the Bible. And interestingly, these 2 are mentioned also at the end of the Bible story. In the last book of the Bible, you have Egypt and Babylon mentioned also specifically, although in the book of Revelation, these are to be interpreted symbolically. In Revelation chapter 11, we have Egypt mentioned, and Revelation chapter 18, we have Babylon mentioned, but these are symbolic powers based on the real historic powers of kingdoms of Egypt and Babylon from the ancient times, representing, on the one hand, great oppressive powers that oppressed the people of God, because the Israelites were slaves both in Egypt and later on in Babylon, but also representing false religions. So these are the representatives of false religions and oppressive powers that oppress the people of God. And that is the image that we find at the very beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis, then moving to the book of Exodus. Now, if you zoom in a little bit more, let's say for the sake of argument, okay, so these 2 rivers, everybody agrees, Euphrates and Tigris, they are mentioned in the book of Genesis. flowing out of the Garden of Eden. They can be easily identified. There they are, around Iraq, Babylon flowing, not sure in which direction, but they go into Turkey, all the way into Turkey. You can see here, if you zoom in, especially Euphrates River, it just goes and goes and meanders. And there's some bits and pieces of lakes and bits and pieces of bodies of water. You can see that used to be connected probably. You can follow the line there, and probably similar with Tigris, though it's not as big as Euphrates. So these two rivers are okay, but let's say that one of the fourth rivers is also the River Nile, if that is the case, because there's nothing else around here. There's no rivers on this side, there's nothing here, there's nothing here. So this is the closest big river here. So if you got 1, 2, and 3, what would be the fourth river? Again, nobody knows, but I'll just zoom in here. It's interesting. It's a tiny river nowadays. It flows right through Israel. It's the River Jordan that flows, you can see, from the Sea of Galilee, Tiberias, in all the way down into the Dead Sea. Why do I mention that? Because just by looking at the satellite imagery from above, you can follow the Jordan River. You can see that Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, the Dead Sea. But then if you follow the line, there's this big massive area of water here that looks like it's been connected. There's a straight line running all the way from here, from the Red Sea through Israel, all the way to the Sea of Galilee, and then probably it looked a bit different in the past. And certainly the River Jordan is much drier now than it used to be, and it's been changing even in recent decades. You can see how the water is disappearing more and more. But who knows how this river looked like thousands of years ago? Perhaps this line here may have been a great body of water also, all the way from the Red Sea, perhaps to the Mediterranean. Who knows how things looked like thousands of years ago, but that could have been one of the rivers that is mentioned in the Garden of Eden. Maybe, maybe not. It's just a suggestion. But it's interesting that once you continue to read the story of the Bible, you move into the book of Exodus. When the Israelites come out of Egypt and move away from River Nile, and they're supposed to place themselves somewhere in between the River Nile and River Euphrates, pretty much exactly halfway between Nile and Euphrates, in this place called the Promised Land, or Canaan. It's interesting, once they settled into the Promised Land, this is it really here. You can see the River Jordan goes right through the middle of it, and a couple of tribes are to settle on this side towards the Mediterranean Sea, and a couple of tribes are to settle here on this other side, east side of the River Jordan. So they're right smack on River Jordan, Israelites and the Promised Land. Now, why this place? Why this place? When you read the story of the Israelites coming out of Egypt, and all the miracles happening and everything else following them as they walked from Egypt towards the Promised Land through the desert for many years, you read some interesting things, like their shoes did not wear, their clothes did not wear, they had food coming down from heaven. So you have an idea of God partially restoring the Garden of Eden conditions, where their food is plentiful. There is no need to worry about clothes and shoes or anything like that. The original provisions that God has given to humankind in the Garden of Eden, they didn't have to work hard for them. There's food that was plentiful to pick and eat, and it wasn't exactly the same, obviously, because this was just a partial restoration of the conditions that we find in the Garden of Eden. And also, as the Israelites went out of Egypt, God promised to them that they would not be afflicted by the same diseases as the Egyptians. That doesn't mean that they will not get any diseases, but there is this idea: you will not get the diseases that the Egyptians get. And so partial, it's a partial restoration of things in terms of health, wear and tear, food provisions, uh, and God miraculously led them to this place called the Promised Land. And even later on, when you read further on in the prophets in the Old Testament, it's mentioned this idea: if you look after my house, if you look after my temple and paying tithe, you will not be afflicted by pests on your fields and things like that. So that's quite supernatural, because pests are everywhere. So basically, we find that in the Promised Land here, in the modern Israel, we find the River Jordan right in the middle of it, and a couple of tribes, half of the tribes on one side of the River Jordan, and the other half on the other side, east and west side of the River Jordan. And you get an impression that if God is trying to partially restore the original conditions of the Garden of Eden, to a degree, just a little bit. Perhaps he is even trying to restore the location. Perhaps that was the place where the Garden of Eden was originally. Nobody knows really, and it's just a suggestion. It seems to make sense that that is what God is restoring, because that was his original plan, original design, and he probably hasn't scrapped it completely. There is a plan B. The whole story of the Bible is basically plan B, apart from the first two chapters of the Bible and the last two chapters of the Bible. Everything is plan B in between. But God seemed to be restoring partially the conditions of the Garden of Eden. He seems to be leading his people back into that land, which is later on called the Promised Land, not the Garden of Eden. It's not exactly the same, because in the Garden of Eden there is no death, there is life eternal, and all the other things which are not to be found in this present life and present age. So that's where we are. Promised Land is a partial restoration of Edenic conditions. Plentiful food, no Egyptian diseases, no wear and tear on clothes or shoes. That was temporarily while traveling through the desert. Remember all those stones in the desert? For 40 years walking on stones and no wear and tear on your shoes. That's supernatural. No pests on crops in the Promised Land and stuff like that. That's it. So that's where we find ourselves in this first part of the story of the Bible, that begins right at the center of this great area of wear and tear, going from the Western Sahara to Gobi Desert, from Mongolia, China to Morocco. And right here, you can see Iraq. That's where we begin. That's where the river Euphrates is. That's where the Garden of Eden was, somewhere around there, probably. Let's just circle it, a bit of a bigger circle, what we call the Middle East, somewhere there. That's where the story of the Bible begins. And it's interesting that it's geographically and geologically speaking, it's right at the center of this great area of wear and tear. Whatever happened there, the rest of the earth looks a bit better, greener, but there is something strange going on there. And right at the center of it and center of the story is the beginning of the Bible, the story of the Garden of Eden, and the story of the four great rivers. And this is where we are. So, in the next presentation, we will move from the Garden of Eden to Noah and the flood, and we will look at the map again and see how the story continues. So thank you for watching, and God bless you.